Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. And we start today's episode as we usually do with the economy. As we will see, today's thumbnail and title are not over the top. Things are looking very serious as the economy continues to worsen. Now, there's been so much to cover over the last 24 hours, and we already did a full episode on the economy yesterday, so I just wanted to move through several salient points we need to take note of. Yesterday, Monday, there was the State Council Executive Meeting. According to the readout of the meeting, it discussed, quote, arrangements made for implementing the decisions and deployments of the Central Economic Work Conference, end quote. We remember that the Central Economic Work Conference was last week, and the consensus appears to be disappointment. As veteran China analyst Bill Bishop observed today, quote, markets were not impressed by the readout from the conference, as even though anyone paying attention knew the meeting would not announce specific numbers or targets, I think the broader sense is that the leadership is still not acting with enough urgency to deal with the growing risks of a severely damaging deflationary spiral. End quote. Indeed, according to new data, China's consumer price index is still above zero, but only barely, gaining just 0.2% in November from a year earlier, compared with a 2.7% increase in the US. The Chinese rate is well below the roughly 2% level that most central banks consider healthy for their economies. Prominent China economist Hong Hao on X this week posted images of Chinese restaurant signs with huge discounts, expressing, quote, signs of deflation everywhere, $25 BBQ for two, all that you can eat, menu price back to 10 years ago, full table packed with various veggies, only $2. Indeed, the prices are insane. It would be even more insane to believe that there is no deflationary pressure, end quote. Even former central bank governor Zhou Xiaochun told an economic forum over the weekend that China's high level of savings, estimated at 44.3%, is, quote, a reflection of a lack of domestic demand, end quote. In a sign of how seriously investors are viewing China's deflationary problems, 30-year Chinese bonds already slid below Japan's for the first time since 2006. Falling long-term bond yields, which move inversely to prices, signal that investors think China's economy is shaky, leading them to seek the safety of bonds rather than investments such as stocks. Then, yesterday, China's 10-year sovereign yield fell 6 basis points to 1.71%, extending a decline from above 2% at the end of November. The move came after more poor economic numbers, which we examined yesterday. Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis, in a post today, expressed on this development, quote, wow, exactly 2 weeks ago the Financial Times thought it was a big deal that the yield on China's 10-year bond had dropped below 2% for the first time ever. And they were right, it was a big deal at the time. But that seems like nothing today. The 10-year closed Monday at 1.72%, down from 2.62% a year ago, and it's the 30-year that dropped below 2% for the first time. It's pretty clear that Chinese investors are not betting on a pickup soon in either inflation or GDP growth, end quote. Indeed, Tianfeng Securities, Zheshang Securities, and Standard Chartered Bank are among firms that now predict yields will drop to as low as 1.5% by the end of next year. However, as we saw yesterday, despite deflationary pressures and persistent slowdown, China's debt-to-GDP ratio continues to surge. As such, Beijing is between a rock and a hard place, wanting to stimulate growth but without further damaging government balance sheets. Robin Xing, chief China economist at Morgan Stanley, in a note yesterday expressed that Beijing faces a, quote, long battle, end quote, to reflate the economy, adding that 2025 will, quote, be the year of trying, end quote, and, quote, they will try a lot of things. See, it's not enough to keep trying. Maybe by 2026, finally they will find the right dose of policies, a combination of consumption-centric stimulus plus social safety net reform, end quote. He is essentially saying that he expects no progress to be made to turn the economy around in 2025. Meanwhile, property continues to be a festering wound. We already covered the price decline in yesterday's episode, but new official data published today shows that sales of new commercial property, mostly homes but also including office space, for the January through November period fell 19.2% year on year. Incredibly, as Japanese financial media outlet Nikkei Asia explains in a report today, quote, China's property sales this year are likely to come in at about half the level recorded just 3 years ago, end quote. That is, property sales since their peak have collapsed 50%. I know some viewers think I overuse terms like collapse or crash when discussing the economy, but I do not know how else to discuss developments like this. 50% down from a peak is a crash, however which way you look at it. Indeed, as I prepare to film this video, it was just reported by China's foreign exchange regulator that China's capital markets witnessed a record outflow of $45.7 billion in November. Years of deflationary pressure, historically low yields, surging debt, and almost every single economic indicator continuously disappointing. Tens of trillions in damage done to household assets across stocks and property. However you look at it, this is an economic crisis, and we should make no apology in calling a spade a spade. Now, I am not saying that the entire system is going to come crashing down. All that I am saying is that these economic indicators are real, and it suggests that China is going through a permanent, painful, long-term structural slowdown in economic output. And this will have significant social and political implications, which we will be following closely here as we move into 2025. If you want to follow along as we follow these developments, don't forget to subscribe. Meanwhile, as we have seen with this economic collapse, Beijing is deeply concerned with growing unrest and is responding. As the US-based Wall Street Journal writes yesterday, quote, faced with rising social frustrations and public unrest, China's leaders are ramping up security measures and squelching discordant views on the country's economic health, end quote. In recent weeks, some parents of school-going children have noticed heightened security at elementary schools in Beijing, where authorities have deployed armed paramilitary police officers dressed in camouflage uniforms to guard the entrances. This is not a positive sign. As the Wall Street Journal writes, quote, officials have fanned out to screen for people who have suffered financial or emotional setbacks and assess their risks of disrupting public order. Authorities also deployed troops to help guard some schools after some recent attacks appeared to target students. Internet censors, meanwhile, have scrubbed viral commentaries about weaknesses in the world's second largest economy. End quote. We have followed all of these developments over the last several weeks here on China Update. None of this will be unfamiliar to regular viewers. At the latest meeting this month, the party's elite Politburo implicitly acknowledged the connection between economic difficulties and social unrest, ordering officials to, quote, protect people's livelihoods, end quote, with the goal of, quote, ensuring the overall stability of society, end quote. Christian Gabel, a professor at the University of Vienna who researches state-society relations in China, recently, that is last week, observed that recent dissent reflects disillusionment among many younger and middle-class Chinese who face bleaker economic prospects, explaining, quote, if the party cannot protect its people and cannot make the economy grow, and these are the two things that it has placed its legitimacy on, there is a problem for the party, end quote. Next up, we move to developments in US-China competition. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are a tremendous help for the channel. I rely on this to keep the channel growing. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below for those who want to keep China Update financially sustainable. I restrict sponsored features to 1 to 2 per month so that the majority of financial support comes from subscribers. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Okay, let's continue. We move on to US-China developments. In a long press conference yesterday, Monday, in response to a question about General Secretary Xi Jinping, President-elect Trump said that Xi has not said he will not be coming to the inauguration, that they have been communicating via letters, and adding, quote, China and the United States can together solve all the problems in the world if you think about it. So it's very important. He was a friend of mine. We spent hours and hours talking, and he's an amazing guy. End quote. Nevertheless, actions speak louder than words, and actions point to a more adversarial approach towards China in a second Trump administration. US-based Politico reports yesterday that President-elect Donald Trump's allies on Capitol Hill are pushing end-of-year legislation that would restrict US investments in China, quote, with one thing in mind, giving the future occupant of the White House maximum flexibility when implementing the law, end quote. The outlet explains that an overly restrictive bill could make it more difficult to strike a deal with China, which might view the law as one less reason to offer Trump concessions. In the China bill, one notable change would give the president complete discretion to sanction US companies that violate the potential new investment rules, so he can use them as leverage in conversations once in office. Meanwhile, when Trump picked billionaire financier Howard Lutnick to be the Commerce Secretary, many observers at the time hoped his Wall Street sensibilities would mean he would be less aggressive on trade than his main competitor for the post, former trade chief Robert Lighthizer. The same outlet, Politico, in a separate story today writes, quote, that sentiment is quickly evaporating. Instead, Lutnick is emerging as one of the incoming administration's premier trade hawks, working closely with Lighthizer's protege, U.S. Trade Representative nominee Jamison Greer, to set Trump's trade and tariff agenda for the first 100 days. While the exact parameters, like which tariff laws will be used and how high the tariff rates will be, are not yet set, the emerging expectation is that any actions are going to be aggressive, like Trump's campaign rhetoric. End quote. Meanwhile, and finally for today, TikTok has lost its bid for an injunction to delay the January 19th deadline from going into effect. The court said over the weekend that TikTok and its users, quote, have not identified any case in which a court, after rejecting a constitutional challenge to an act of Congress, has enjoined the act from going into effect while review is sought in the Supreme Court, end quote. TikTok CEO Mr. Chu met with President-elect Trump yesterday afternoon. The pre-scheduled meeting is believed to be the first time the men have met since Trump's electoral victory in November. TikTok is now seeking the Supreme Court to block the law. In its emergency application to the Supreme Court, TikTok says that the law, quote, will shutter one of America's most popular speech platforms the day before a presidential inauguration. This, in turn, will silence the speech of applicants and the many Americans who use the platform to communicate about politics, commerce, arts, and other matters of public concern. End quote. The Supreme Court could make a quick decision on the case. However, commentators argue that the court would likely rule in favor of upholding the ban. Indeed, the Supreme Court may decide not to review the case at all, in which case TikTok is out of luck, as the ban comes in one day before Trump re-enters office. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.